He thought it was just a fainting bride, but the truth beneath her makeup was about to silence an entire room. The chandelier light shimmered across crystal glasses and polished marble as Ava Johnson stood at the center of the ballroom, her white gown flowing like something out of a dream she had never quite believed was hers. The soft music of a string quartet drifting through the air while guests in tailored suits and elegant dresses leaned in close, whispering behind polite smiles. Because even in celebration, there was something about Ava that didn't quite belong, something quiet, something too still, like she was holding her breath in a room that demanded perfection, her dark skin glowing under layers of carefully applied makeup, flawless at a distance. But under the warm golden lights, there was the faintest suggestion of something beneath the surface, something not meant to be seen. And as she lifted her hand to adjust the veil resting lightly against her shoulders, her fingers trembled just enough for the movement to go unnoticed by most, but not by everyone, not by the man. Standing near the back of the room, watching without speaking, Dominic Castellano, his presence cutting through the celebration like a shadow no one acknowledged but everyone felt, his tailored black suit absorbing the light, his expression unreadable as his eyes followed Ava with a precision that suggested he wasn't watching a wedding, he was studying something else entirely, something out of place. And then it happened, subtle at first, a slight sway, a pause in her step as she turned toward the altar, her smile faltering for a fraction of a second before the room caught up to the moment, before the music could cover it, before the whispers could begin. Ava Johnson collapsed, her body folding gently against the pristine white aisle as a gasp rippled through the crowd like a wave breaking against glass. The violinist faltering mid-note, the officiant stepping back in confusion, and for a heartbeat, no one moved. No one spoke, because the scene didn't fit the script they had all come to witness. And then the murmurs began, low and sharp, cutting through the silence, speculation. Dressed as concern, judgment disguised as curiosity. "Is she okay?" someone whispered. But the tone carried doubt, not care. Another voice followed, quieter but colder. "Maybe it's nerves, or something else." And still, no one stepped forward, no one reached down, as if touching her would mean acknowledging something they didn't want to understand. And through it all, Dominic didn't rush, didn't call out, didn't react the way others expected. He simply moved, slow and deliberate, each step measured against the marble floor as his gaze never left Ava's face. Because what he had seen wasn't the fall, it was what came after, the faint crack along the edge of her foundation, barely visible unless you were looking for it. A subtle shift in texture where perfection should have held. And as the room filled with noise, with confusion and quiet judgment, he reached her, kneeling just enough to bring himself closer to the truth no one else seemed willing to see, his hand hovering for a moment before moving with careful intent, not to wake her, not to comfort her, but to understand, because something about this moment, about this woman beneath layers of silence and expectation, was already telling him a story the room wasn't ready to hear. And in that suspended breath between assumption and reality, the celebration began to unravel without a single word being spoken. The room did not move with him. It hesitated, caught somewhere between curiosity and discomfort as Dominic Castellano lowered himself beside Ava Johnson, his presence shifting the air in a way no one could ignore, yet no one dared to interrupt. The music had already faded into an awkward silence, and the only sound left was the faint hum of air conditioning and the uneven rhythm of distant whispers. Her body lay still against the aisle, her hand curled slightly, as if she had tried to hold on to something just before the moment slipped away. And from this close, the perfection everyone admired began to fracture into something else entirely. The smooth finish of her makeup no longer seamless but uneven, faint lines forming where the light struck her cheek at an angle. Dominic's eyes narrowed not in suspicion but in recognition, because he had seen masks before, in boardrooms, in back rooms, in places where truth was always hidden beneath something polished and acceptable. And this was no different. He reached for a folded linen napkin from a nearby table, his movement calm, controlled, as though he were simply correcting a detail out of place rather than uncovering something the room was not prepared to face. A woman's voice cut through the tension, sharp and low. Should someone call an ambulance? But it was not concern that followed the question. It was hesitation, as if even help required permission in a space like this. Dominic did not answer. He did not look up. He simply brought the cloth closer to Ava's face, pausing for a fraction of a second, as if confirming what his instincts had already told him. Then gently, deliberately, he pressed the edge of the cloth against her cheek, not harshly, not urgently, but with a precision that suggested he was not trying to wake her. He was trying to see her. And as the cloth moved, the illusion began to shift. The flawless layers softened, revealing a faint discoloration beneath, something that did not belong to cosmetics or lighting or shadow, something real, something human. A quiet intake of breath rippled through the nearest guests, subtle but undeniable, as eyes began to focus not on the spectacle of a fallen bride, but on the detail that had been hidden in plain sight. Dominic leaned in slightly, the overhead light catching the edge of his jaw as his expression remained steady, unreadable, yet unmistakably certain. And in that moment, the room began to understand that this was no longer about a wedding interruption. This was about something they had all chosen not to notice. Ava's breathing was shallow but present, her chest rising just enough to confirm she was still there, still part of the moment they had tried to dismiss. And Dominic's gaze lifted briefly, scanning the faces around him, not accusing, not questioning, just observing the distance between their reactions and the reality at his feet. Then his attention returned to her, to the details that told a story no one had asked to hear, the slight tension in her brow even in unconsciousness, the careful placement of makeup that now seemed less like beauty and more like protection. And without raising his voice, without demanding attention, he spoke, his tone low, steady, carrying further than any shout could have. She did not collapse for attention. The words settled into the silence, not as a correction, but as a quiet truth that left no room for argument. And in that space where judgment had once filled every corner, something shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough for the room to begin seeing her not as a disruption, not as a mistake in their perfect evening, but as a person whose story had been carefully hidden beneath layers they had never thought to question. The silence did not break. It deepened, stretching across the ballroom like a held breath no one dared release as Dominic's words settled into the space. And for the first time, the whispers changed direction, no longer questioning her, but quietly questioning themselves. The groom stood frozen near the altar, his hand still halfway extended from where he had been reaching for her moments before. His expression caught between confusion and something less comfortable, something closer to calculation, because this was no longer the perfect narrative he had prepared for, no longer the flawless image of a wedding that elevated his name. And as Dominic remained beside Ava, his attention unwavering, another detail surfaced, subtle but undeniable, the edge of her wrist visible beneath the delicate lace of her sleeve, where the makeup had not reached as carefully, where the illusion had not been maintained, and there, faint but present, was a pattern that did not belong to celebration or accident, a mark softened by time yet unmistakably real. Dominic's gaze lingered there for a moment longer than coincidence would allow, not reacting outwardly, but storing the detail with quiet precision, because patterns told stories, and this one did not match the version being presented in front of 200 guests dressed for perfection. A man stepped forward then, sharply dressed, his tone controlled but edged with impatience. "This is unnecessary, she just needs air." His words directed not at Ava, but at Dominic, as though the situation required management rather than understanding. Dominic did not look at him immediately. Instead, he adjusted the cloth once more, revealing just enough to confirm what had already begun to form in his mind. The makeup was not applied for beauty, it was layered with intention, covering inconsistencies that repeated, not randomly, but deliberately. And when he finally lifted his gaze, it was not confrontational, it was measured, the kind of look that did not demand silence but created it. "How long has she been like this?" he asked, not raising his voice. Yet every word carried across the room with a weight that forced an answer. The man hesitated, just briefly, but long enough to be noticed. "She has been fine," he replied, too quickly, too smooth, and the room felt it. That slight misalignment between truth and performance. Ava stirred then, barely, her fingers tightening against the fabric of her dress as if responding to something distant, something internal, and her lips parted just enough to release a faint breath that carried more strain than weakness. Dominic leaned closer, not intruding, but attentive, his presence steady in contrast to the growing unease around him. And in that fragile moment between unconsciousness and awareness, her expression shifted, not peaceful, not relieved, but burdened, as if even in stillness she was holding something back, something she had carried alone for far too long. And when her eyes fluttered open for the briefest second, unfocused and searching, they did not look toward the altar, they did not look toward the man she was meant to marry, they looked past everything, as though searching for a way out rather than a way forward. And Dominic saw it, not as a fleeting detail, but as confirmation, because people revealed truth in the moments they could no longer perform. And this was one of those moments. He straightened slightly, his expression unchanged, but his certainty now complete. This was not a simple collapse. This was not nerves, and it was certainly not attention-seeking. This was something carefully hidden, something sustained over time. And as the weight of that realization settled into the room, the celebration no longer felt like a beginning. It felt like something that should have been stopped long before it ever began. The air shifted in a way no one could name, but everyone could feel. The kind of quiet that settles when a truth begins to surface and refuses to be pushed back down. Dominic rose slowly from where he had been kneeling, not abandoning Ava, but repositioning himself between her and the room. A subtle movement that created a boundary without needing to announce it. And in that small act, the dynamic changed. The guests who had been leaning forward with curiosity now leaned back, uncertain, as if they had stepped too close to something they were not meant to witness. The groom took a step forward then, his polished shoes clicking against the marble with more force than necessary, his composure tightening at the edges. "She just needs a moment," he said again, louder this time, as if repetition could make it true. But his eyes did not go to Ava. They flickered instead to the guests, to the image, to the control he was trying to regain. Dominic did not move aside, did not acknowledge the attempt to redirect the moment. His focus remained steady, and when he spoke, it was not to challenge, it was to clarify. A moment does not leave patterns. His voice was calm, almost conversational, yet it carried enough weight to halt the groom mid-step. The words did not accuse, but they removed the comfort of denial, and that was enough. A faint murmur rippled through the crowd again, softer now, less certain, as people began to notice what they had overlooked, the uneven texture along Ava's jawline, the slight discoloration near her temple, details that had been dismissed as lighting or shadow now reassembled into something intentional, something hidden. And as the room adjusted its perception, Ava stirred once more, this time more noticeably, her hand shifting against the fabric of her gown as though the weight of it had suddenly become too much, her breathing uneven but steady. And when her eyes opened again, they held focus for just a second longer, enough to register the figures around her, enough to recognize where she was. And in that instant, something passed across her face that no makeup could conceal. Not fear exactly, but resignation, the kind that comes from enduring something for so long that it becomes part of you. Dominic saw it. The way her gaze did not settle on the man waiting at the altar, did not search for reassurance from the crowd, but instead drifted downward, inward, as if she were retreating even while surrounded by hundreds of people, and he understood. Then that whatever truth lay beneath the surface, it was not sudden. It had been building quietly, carefully, long before this moment forced it into the light. He reached out again, not to uncover more, but to steady her, his hand resting lightly near hers without pressure, without intrusion, a gesture that asked nothing but offered presence. And for a brief second, her fingers responded, not grasping, not holding, but acknowledging. A small connection that spoke louder than anything said aloud. The groom's voice cut through again, sharper now, edged with something closer to frustration. "This is not the time for this." And the statement hung in the air, revealing more than it concealed, because it was not concern that drove it. It was timing, image, control. Dominic finally turned his gaze fully toward him, not confrontational, not aggressive, but precise. The kind of attention that stripped away pretense without needing to raise a hand or a voice. "Then when was the time?" he asked. And the question did not demand an answer. It exposed the absence of one. The room fell into a deeper silence, heavier, more aware, as the celebration that had once felt effortless now revealed the tension it had been built upon. And in the center of it all, Ava lay no longer invisible, no longer overlooked, but undeniably seen, not for the role she was meant to play, but for the truth she could no longer hide. The question did not echo loudly, but it lingered in the air with a weight that pressed against every polished surface in the room, and no one answered, not because they did not hear it, but because answering would require acknowledging something they had all silently agreed to ignore. The groom's jaw tightened as he stood there, his posture still formal but no longer composed, his gaze flickering once more toward the guests as if searching for alignment, for support, for someone to restore the version of events he had prepared. But the room had already shifted, the subtle balance of power no longer resting on appearance or expectation, but on the quiet certainty standing between him and Ava. Dominic did not raise his voice again, did not repeat himself. He simply turned his attention back to her, and this time, his focus was not on what was hidden, but on what had been endured, his eyes tracing the details with a clarity that came from experience, not assumption. The way the makeup had been layered thicker in certain areas, not for style but for coverage, the way her breathing carried a rhythm that suggested exhaustion more than shock, the way her body remained tense even in stillness, as though rest was something unfamiliar. And then, without warning, Ava spoke. Not fully, not clearly, but enough, her voice barely more than a breath, fragile but present. It is okay. The words slipped out instinctively, not directed at anyone in particular, more like a reflex than a statement. And that was what made the room go still again, because reassurance in that moment did not belong to her, not when she was the one on the floor, not when she was the one everyone had overlooked. And yet she offered it anyway, as if it had been expected of her for far too long. Dominic's expression did not change, but something in his gaze sharpened, not anger, not frustration, but recognition, because people who said it is okay when it clearly was not had learned that truth did not always protect them, that silence was safer, that endurance was easier than resistance. He leaned slightly closer, his voice lower now, quieter than before, but steady enough to reach her. You do not have to say that. And for a moment, her eyes met his, fully this time, not drifting, not distant, but present, and in that brief connection, something unspoken passed between them, not trust, not yet, but the absence of expectation, the absence of demand, and that alone was enough to shift something inside her. Her fingers moved again, this time not from reflex, but from awareness, brushing lightly against the fabric near her wrist, where the edge of her sleeve met skin that had not been fully concealed. And Dominic followed the movement, not intruding, just observing. And there it was again, that same pattern, faint but consistent, not random, not accidental, something that had been repeated over time, something that had required effort to hide. And when he looked up again, his gaze moved past the groom, past the guests, to the older couple seated near the front, their expressions carefully controlled but their silence more revealing than any reaction. They did not step forward, did not call her name, did not break the distance that had already been established long before this day. And that was when the realization settled fully into place, not just for him, but for anyone willing to see it. This was not a sudden moment. This was a continuation, a story that had been unfolding quietly behind closed doors, behind polite smiles, behind layers of makeup and expectation. And as the truth edged closer to the surface, the room no longer felt like a place of celebration. It felt like a stage where something carefully constructed was beginning to fall apart, not with noise, not with chaos, but with the quiet, undeniable presence of what had always been there, waiting to be seen. The silence no longer felt uncertain. It felt heavy, anchored in something that could not be undone. And as Ava lay there, no longer trying to reassure anyone, no longer hiding behind instinct, the truth began to surface not through words, but through the absence of resistance. Her breathing steadied slightly, not because the situation had changed, but because something inside her had shifted. Something that had been held in place for far too long was beginning to loosen, and Dominic saw it. The way her shoulders lowered just enough, the way her gaze no longer searched for approval, but simply existed where it was. And that was when he spoke again, Not to the room, not to the groom, but to her, his voice quiet, deliberate. You have been carrying this for a long time. It was not a question, and that was what made it different. It did not demand explanation. It acknowledged reality. And for a moment, she did not respond, her eyes closing briefly as if the weight of being seen was something unfamiliar, something she had not prepared for. And when she opened them again, there was a hesitation, not fear, but the kind of pause that comes before a truth is allowed to exist outside of silence. Her voice came softly, uneven but clear enough to be heard. It was supposed to be. Just one day. The words did not explain everything, but they changed everything, because now there was context, now there was intention, and the room felt it. The shift from assumption to revelation. Dominic remained still, giving the moment space, allowing her words to settle without interruption. And as she continued, her voice gained the smallest amount of strength, not confidence, but clarity. Just today, just this. Her fingers tightened slightly against the fabric near her wrist, as if grounding herself in something real. After this, it would be over. The groom moved then, a step forward, his composure breaking at the edges. Ava, you are not well. You should not be saying things like this. His tone controlled, but urgent, as if the words themselves were more dangerous than whatever truth they carried. But Dominic did not look at him, did not acknowledge the interruption, because the focus was no longer on preserving an image. It was on understanding what had been hidden. Beneath it, Ava's gaze shifted again, not toward the groom, but toward the older couple seated near the front, her expression tightening slightly, not in anger, but in something quieter, something closer to resignation. They said it would fix everything, she whispered, and this time, the room reacted, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a collective stillness that carried more weight than any outburst. Because now the narrative had changed completely. This was no longer a simple wedding. This was something arranged, something constructed, something that required her to stand at the center of it, while carrying a burden no one had questioned. Dominic's eyes followed her gaze to the couple she had indicated, and he saw what had been there all along. The controlled posture, the careful silence, the absence of intervention, and it aligned too perfectly with everything else. This was not coincidence. This was design. He turned his attention back to Ava, his voice steady, grounding. And what did it cost you? The question was not sharp, not accusatory, but it opened a door that had been closed for far too long. And for a moment, she did not answer, her eyes lowering again, her breath catching slightly as if the answer itself carried weight. And when she finally spoke, it was barely above a whisper, but it was enough, everything. And the word did not echo. It settled. It filled the space with a truth that could not be dismissed, because it was not dramatic, it was not exaggerated, it was simple, and that was what made it undeniable. And as the room absorbed that single word, the illusion that had once defined the moment dissolved completely, leaving behind something far more real, something far more difficult to ignore. The word did not fade. It remained, suspended in the air like something too heavy to move past. And for a moment no one spoke, not because they did not want to, but because there was nothing left to say that could restore what had just been revealed. Ava's gaze remained lowered, her breathing steady but fragile, as if each inhale required effort, and yet there was a clarity in her now that had not been there before. A quiet release that came from no longer pretending. Dominic did not rush the silence. He let it settle, let the room absorb the truth in its simplest form, because anything louder would have weakened it. The groom finally stepped forward again, his control slipping further with each passing second. This is not how this was supposed to happen, he said, not to Ava, not to Dominic, but to the situation itself, as if the problem was not what had been done, but that it had been exposed. Dominic's eyes lifted to him then, calm, unwavering. No, he replied. It is exactly how it was always going to happen. And the statement did not accuse, it clarified, because truths like this did not disappear, they waited, and eventually they surfaced. The older couple shifted in their seats, their composure tightening as the attention turned toward them, the woman's hands folded carefully in her lap, the man's posture rigid, both maintaining the same distance they had held from the beginning, and that distance spoke louder now than any denial could. Dominic looked at them, not with hostility, but with precision, the kind that left no space for misinterpretation. "You knew," he said, and again, it was not a question, it was an acknowledgement. The man's jaw tightened, his response measured. "We did what was necessary," and the phrase landed with a weight that revealed everything it tried to conceal. Necessary for whom? Necessary for what? The room felt it. The shift from discomfort to realization. Because now the pieces aligned. The silence, the control, the expectation placed on someone who had been given no choice. Ava's fingers curled slightly against the fabric of her dress again, but this time it was not from tension, it was from release. The truth no longer trapped beneath layers of silence, and Dominic turned back to her, his voice steady, grounding. "You do not have to finish something that was never yours to begin with." The words were simple, but they carried something she had not been offered before, permission, and for a moment, she did not respond, her eyes lifting slowly, not toward the altar, not toward the guests, but toward him, searching not for direction, but for confirmation, and what she found was not pressure, not expectation, but stillness, a space where her decision could exist without being shaped by others. The room remained silent, watching, waiting, but no longer controlling, and Ava took a breath, deeper this time, steadier, her voice soft but clear when it came. "I cannot do this." And the statement did not break. It held. It carried through the room with a strength that did not need volume. The groom's expression hardened, but he did not move, because something had shifted beyond his control, beyond anyone's control. The moment no longer belonged to them. It belonged to her. And as the realization settled, the carefully constructed image of the day unraveled. Completely, not in chaos, not in noise, but in the quiet, undeniable presence of a choice that could no longer be taken from her. The words did not echo, but they changed everything. And for a moment the room remained frozen, as if unsure how to move forward without the script it had relied on. Ava's voice still lingered in the air, steady despite its softness, and the absence of resistance in her posture made it clear that this was not hesitation, it was decision. Dominic did not respond immediately. He did not affirm or correct, because what she had said did not require validation. It stood on its own, and that was what made it powerful. The groom exhaled sharply, his composure unraveling further as he looked between her and the guests, searching for something to regain control. "You are confused," he said, his tone tighter now, less refined. "You do not understand what this means." But the statement felt hollow the moment it left him, because for the first time, she did understand, and that understanding had shifted the entire foundation of the moment. Ava slowly pushed herself up, not fully standing, but enough to lift her weight from the floor, her movements careful, deliberate, as if reclaiming control over her own body required the same effort as reclaiming her voice. Dominic remained close, not assisting, not interfering, simply present, allowing her space without leaving her alone, and as she steadied herself, the layers of the illusion continued to fall away, not dramatically, but with quiet finality. Her veil slipping slightly from her shoulder, her makeup no longer concealing what it was meant to hide, and yet none of it mattered now, because the room was no longer looking at perfection. It was looking at truth. The older couple exchanged a brief glance, one that carried more urgency than anything they had shown before. The man leaning forward just enough to speak, his voice controlled but edged with something harder. "You are making a mistake." And the words carried the weight of expectation, of pressure, of everything that had led to this moment. But Ava did not look at him. She did not respond immediately, because the choice she had just made was not about them. It was about herself, and that was something new, something unfamiliar. She took another breath, deeper this time, and when she finally spoke again, her voice did not waver. "No," she said, simple, clear, "I am correcting one." And the distinction settled into the room with a clarity that left no room for argument. Dominic's gaze shifted briefly across the guests, observing the change in their expressions. The uncertainty, the quiet recognition that what they had witnessed was not disruption, but revelation. And when his eyes returned to Ava, there was no approval in them, no expectation, just acknowledgement, the kind that recognized the weight of what she had done without diminishing it. The groom stepped back then, not by choice, But because there was nowhere left to step forward, the moment no longer belonged to him. The ceremony no longer belonged to anyone but the truth that had interrupted it. And Ava straightened fully now, her posture no longer held together by obligation, but by something steadier, something that came from within. The room remained silent, not out of confusion, but out of understanding, because what had just happened could not be undone. It could only be accepted. And as she stood there, no longer hidden, no longer silent, the carefully constructed image of the day dissolved completely, leaving behind something far more real, something far more powerful. A woman who had chosen herself in a room that had never expected her to. No one applauded. No one spoke, because the moment did not ask for noise. It demanded recognition, and the silence that filled the ballroom was no longer empty. It was full of something far more powerful, understanding. Ava Johnson stood at the center of it all, no longer a bride waiting to be chosen, no longer a figure shaped by expectation, but a person who had stepped out of a story that was never hers to begin with. Her gown still carried the weight of the ceremony that would not happen. Her makeup still bore the traces of what it had tried to conceal, but none of it defined her anymore, because what the room saw now was not perfection, it was truth. Dominic Castellano remained where he was, not stepping forward, not stepping away, simply present, his role in the moment already complete, because he had not changed her decision. He had only made space for it to exist. The guests slowly shifted, not leaving, not dispersing, but adjusting, their attention no longer fixed on spectacle, but on the quiet transformation that had taken place before them. The groom stood still, his expression no longer controlled, no longer composed, but empty of direction, because control required agreement. And that agreement was gone. The older couple said nothing more, their silence now stripped of authority, reduced to something far less certain, because the narrative they had constructed no longer held, and there was no way to rebuild it without confronting what had been exposed. Ava took a step forward then, not toward the altar, not toward the expectations waiting there, but away from them. Her movement steady despite the weight of the moment, and as she passed through the space that had once been arranged for her, it no longer felt like a path she was meant to follow. It felt like something she had outgrown. Dominic's gaze followed her briefly, not with ownership, not with expectation, but with acknowledgement, the kind that did not demand anything in return. And as she moved past him, there was no exchange of words, no need for them, because the moment had already said everything that mattered. The doors at the far end of the ballroom stood open, the light beyond them softer, quieter, different from the controlled glow of chandeliers and polished marble. And as she stepped toward it, the contrast became clear. This was not an escape. It was a transition, from something constructed to something real. The room behind her remained silent, not because it was empty, but because it had been changed, every person present now carrying the weight of what they had witnessed, not as entertainment, not as disruption, but as a reminder that dignity was not something granted by status or ceremony. It was something that existed even when no one chose to see it. And as the doors closed gently behind her, the final image left in that room was not of a wedding interrupted, but of a truth revealed, one that did not need to shout, did not need to prove itself, because it had already done something far more lasting. It had been seen, and in being seen, it had changed everything. And that day, without a single raised voice, the room remembered what dignity looks like.